Hey, Jacqueline, Kevin Ward here. Great question. So here is the email that I just got from one of my clients. I wanted to ask how you would advise the landlord who is trying to sell his property, but the tenant is still occupying the property. So basically, we're dealing with a seller who wants to sell the property while it is still tenant occupied. Now, tenant occupied properties can be a challenge. So there's a couple of things you got to do to work with them. One, the seller's got to want to sell the property. Now, there's a huge benefit for the seller in selling a property that's still occupied, and that is he doesn't have to wait till it's vacant and then it'd be sitting there and trying to sell a vacant property that's costing him money month after month while it's on the market and while it's in escrow before it closes. So that's the positive of selling a property while it's still tenant occupied. The negative is, number one, it can be really difficult to show. Number two, it tends to not show well. And number three, tenants don't always want to cooperate. So the question is, what's in the best interest of the seller? Because the seller is your client, so that's what you've got to look at. He absolutely wants to sell, and he wants to sell it while it's occupied, which is really, if it's a couple of questions. Number one, is it truly an investment property? If it's an investment property that is going to be purchased by an investor, like if it's a duplex or a triplex or a fourplex or more, then it's typically going to be tenant occupied, and tenant occupied actually is better if they're in a lease, because now they're selling a property that already has cash flow built in on it. The new buyers don't have to worry about leasing it out. If it is a single family home that will probably be sold to an owner occupant, now it's a little bit different of an issue because you're selling a property to someone who wants to live in it, but it's not going to probably be staged well and look great. So it's a trade-off. So that's what you've got to sit down with your seller and say, so tell me more about your situation. Tell me what's important to you about selling the property. How soon would you like to have it sold? Would it be financially feasible for you to sell it after they move out, or would you like to sell it while they're still occupied? So let's just say it's to his benefit to sell it while it's still occupied. What do you do? Well, number one is you've got to make sure the seller understands the importance of the tenant cooperating. If the tenant doesn't cooperate, it's murder trying to sell a property, because it's got to show and so forth. So here's basically what I think has been, in my experience, and I've done a lot of these, the most successful way is you want to treat the tenant as if they are the owner when it comes to showing the property, which means you've got to connect with the tenant yourself. You need to meet with them. This is after you've already signed the listing agreement. You meet with the seller, you go over the process, the plan, you kind of get a feel for, is the tenant going to be cooperative? If they're going to be cooperative, because the seller's going to have to give the tenant notice, depending on your state, your laws, and so forth, how that notice has got to be given, and what the lease will allow in terms of showing the property, putting the house on the market, and so forth. But most leases do allow for that. So what you want to do is get the seller to commit, get the listing signed, and so forth. Then you're going to contact the tenant and let them know that, Mr. Landlord has hired me to sell the property. I wanted to set up a time to sit down and talk with you about the process and see what I can do to make it as easy as possible for you and to make it fit with your situation, your lifestyle, and so forth. You want to treat the tenant as important as the landlord, because you want their cooperation and you want them to be an ally, and you want them to see you as somebody who's respectful of them and so forth, because a happy tenant, a cooperative tenant, changes the world. Let me just say, an uncooperative tenant changes the world, makes everything a nightmare. So here's some different things you can do. Number one, encourage the seller to give the tenant an incentive for cooperating. And here's what it boils down to. Don't give them a reduction in rent. If you give them a reduction in rent, tenant is going to take the reduction in rent, they're going to pay less rent, and they may or may not cooperate. So what you do is the seller gives the tenant a written notice that when they close on the property, the seller will give to the tenant a rebate of their rent at closing if they cooperate. And then you stipulate what cooperating means. One, they've got to be able and willing to, they've got to be willing to show the property with a 2-hour notice or 1-hour notice any day with a 2-hour notice, and the property has got to be clean. Beds made, property in showing condition. You kind of lay that out, what that is in terms of the bed's got to be made, the house got to be clean, the dishes got to be washed. You don't have dirty dishes in the sink. You don't have the place a mess. Laundry laying all over, beds unmade. All of that make a house really show horribly. So you kind of make it that, one, they got to be cooperative and showing with a 1-hour notice on, during normal hours from 9 a.m. to dark, sundown, whatever. Um, and that you'll communicate directly with the tenant. Now, once you get that to happen that way, if you get the tenant, you're cooperative with the tenant, you get the seller to offer them a rebate, and it may be a 20% rebate on the rent. It may be a 15% rebate on the rent, but they don't get it till it closes, and they only get it for the period of time that the house is showing, which means if it takes 60 days to get it under contract, it's 2 months of rebate. Because once the property is in an escrow or pending, there's very little time, there's very little issues for the tenant in terms of inconvenience of them having to keep the house spotless and be willing to show it on an hour, on an hour's notice. Once it's pending, when you have inspections done, walkthroughs, and all of that, one, you can schedule them in advance, like a day or more, and the tenant does not have to have the place as spotless. So you want to just limit the landlord's losses on that, the cost of the landlord, and limit the time that the tenant is having to be inconvenienced. Now, again, the thing with your seller may not want to do that. Look, do you want to get the property sold for top dollar as fast as possible? Yes, then this is what we need to do. There are several other issues in your state. Make sure that your landlord has figured out how they're going to give the tenant notice. Are they going to give the tenant notice, depending on the state, whether it's a 30-day notice, 45-day, or 60-day notice, whatever is involved, they've got to be clear on that, and you've got to kind of coordinate those time frames. Now, last thing, if the property is going to really show ugly with the tenant, it's hard to show with the tenant in it, and it's better off to show it after the tenant moves out. The way it's better is it's got to be cleaned up, made market ready, which means paint, carpet, flooring, whatever. For it to really have the return on investment, typically, is you've got to wait till the tenant moves out, and then you got to quickly, the landlord is to quickly get it ready for market. Paint, carpet, cleaning up the landscaping, anything like that, staging it. If it's a nicer property, they probably want to have it staged, and so forth. And they can do that fairly quickly, but it's important that they do it if they're interested in getting top dollar for the property. If it's tenant occupied, again, if it shows great, then it's not going to be that big of an issue. But those are just some of the things you have to weigh out what is in the best interest of the client, and this is going to be part of sitting down and having a consultation with them in the listing presentation or in the pre-qualifying. You say, tell me what's important to you about this. What do you know about the condition of the property? If it's an absentee owner, it's a little more complicated because they probably haven't seen the property recently, and you're probably going to have to set up a time to go preview the property and so forth, to go through all that. You can do that all at the same time when you're meeting with the tenant. However, it's stuff that's got to be done. So do that. Think of the seller's best interest, and then work to make sure you're the problem solver. You're the streamliner. You're the one. This is your role. Your job is to say, I'll handle it for you. And you make it easy for the seller. You make it easy for the tenant. And you always tell the truth and what's going to take to get the results that they want. And then you make it happen. And once you learn how to do it, piece of cake, a little extra work. However, you can get by it and make it work great.